My name is Abby Lester, and I am the director of the JDC Global Archives. I'm delighted to welcome you to the JDC Archives' 6th annual Helen Cohn Memorial Lecture, endowed by Jerry and Linda Spitzer in memory of Jerry's beloved aunt. Our program today is made possible by the generous support of the Miriam Mimi Pasternak-Tobin Public Educational Programming from the JDC Archives. Before we start today's program, I'd like to share a few words about the archives. We hold the organizational history of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, JDC, or the Joint, including millions of documents, hundreds of thousands of photographs, hundreds of artifacts, as well as audio, video, and film recordings dating back to the founding of the organization in 1914. Given the role JDC has played in Jewish lives around the world since 1914, our archives reflect not only the history of the organization, but also the history of world Jewry in the 20th and 21st centuries. And in fact, we are regarded as one of the most important archives for the study of modern Jewish history. Operating out of both New York and Jerusalem, visiting scholars from around the world utilize our unique offerings for their research, as do publishers, journalists, genealogists, curators, filmmakers, among others. To support scholarly research in our collections, we also offer fellowships funded by generous donors. Our speaker today, Don Michman, is Professor Emeritus of Modern Jewish History and the former chair of the Arnold and Leona Finkler Institute of Holocaust Research at Bar Ilan University, Ramat Gan. He's also head of the International Institute for Holocaust Research and incumbent of the John Nyman Chair in Holocaust Studies at Yad Vashem, Jerusalem. His publications, available in 12 languages, cover a broad range of topics on the Shoah, including its historiography, representations, and its impact on Israel, world Jewry, and the Western world, as well as modern Jewish history and anti-Semitism. Among Professor Michman's recently co-authored and co-edited books are, and these just naming a few, there are many more on this list: Getting It Right, Getting It Wrong, Recent Holocaust Scholarship in Light of the Work of Raul Hilberg, Holocaust Historiography, Between 1990 to 2021 in Context, New Insights, Perceptions, Understandings, and Avenues, an Overview and Analysis, and Jewish Solidarity, the Ideal and the Reality in the Turmoil of the Shoah. The title of his lecture today is The Yiddishe Neshome of Yehuda Bauer's Historiography. Professor Michman will present for about 45 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Please note that your microphones are turned off and we will take questions via the Q&A function. You can send us questions at any time during the program. So Professor Michman will now start his lecture.
Thanks, Abby, for the kind introduction. So first of all, I want to thank the JDC Archive for inviting me to give this talk today. It's a great honor for me. Moreover, it brings me back in the time tunnel to the year 1974, when I worked on my PhD thesis for the Hebrew, and I came to New York to do archival research in those archives. The topic of my thesis was German Jewish refugees in the Netherlands after the ascendance of the Nazi Party to power in 1933. So the archives are dear to my heart, and the results from that research also connect to my presentation today. This was when I came to these archives, this was shortly after Yehuda Bauer published the first volume of his trilogy on the history of the joint My Brother's Keeper. The findings of my research, read the work of the JDC with the Netherlands, led me to a different and even opposing understanding to what Bauer had written in his book. I approached him with care, a PhD candidate versus the already famous professor, telling him that my understanding differs from his. And his response was, if you think that I was wrong, don't be afraid to say so. So I must say that this open and warm response really strengthened me. And this has to do also, I would say, with his Yiddishe Neshome, which is, for those who don't understand Yiddish, Jewish spirit or Jewish essence, of Bauer and his historiography. So let's proceed now to Bauer, who was a friend and colleague for many years at Yad Vashem. He actually initiated my coming to the my present position at Yad Vashem, and our offices were next to each other. He had a good sense of humor, was an excellent orator, and though I didn't study in any of his classes at the Hebrew U, I know that he was a fascinating teacher. All his students used and still use to mention this, and I experienced it listening to his lectures in conferences and in courses to many groups visiting Yad Vashem. One of the juicy elements of his lectures was to always bring specific cases of human behavior as examples of the general thesis that he wanted to present. Next to being an interesting historian, he was a fascinating storyteller. And as you know, he died last October at the age of 98, and he was fully active until really the last moments of his life. And he left a surprise. He had written a eulogy about himself, a witty, humoristic one, and that was the eulogy which was read at his grave. So Bauer was one of the staunchest and most energetic promoters of the academic field of genocide studies worldwide, and is usually identified with an interpretation of the Shoah within that context, that is, the Shoah being the genocide of the Jews. However, he described the Shoah as an unprecedented event. He even invented the term unprecedentedness, thus contributing a new work to English vocabulary, and as the most extreme case of genocide. I differ from him in my understanding of the Shoah, and we had interesting exchanges, one of them via email in 2012 and 2013, and maybe I'll publish this exchange one day. Nevertheless, when taking a closer look at his entire oeuvre, one will see that he was also, and even more so, a historian of Jewish history, looking for an answer whether Jewry in modern times, a period defined by a process of secularization, still kept the sense of national solidarity which had been the backbone of Jewish perseverance for tens of centuries, even when being scattered throughout the diaspora. As a declared secular Zionist, this aspect was important for his own identity, and it drove him also to develop a love hate attitude to the religious dimension of Jewishness, to which I will relate later in my talk. His, his examination of this aspect of Jewish solidarity was also a major reason for him to embark early in his career on a comprehensive study of the JDC. And I hope that many of you know at least one of the books in this trilogy. This study culminated in My Brother's Keeper, the book that I mentioned already, A History of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which was published in 1974 and which dealt with the history of the JDC since its establishment up till 1939. The second one was American Jewry in the Holocaust, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, 1939 through 1945, which was published in 1982 and which dealt with the JDC's activities during the Holocaust. And the third one, Out of the Ashes, the impact of American Jews on post-Holocaust European Jewry, which was published in 1989 and which dealt with the immediate post-war World War II period. And on the JDC's website, one can find several talks by him on these topics. And you can see that actually he worked on this project for during about 2 decades. Unique and universal, the characterization of the moral meaning of the Holocaust as a historical event was Yehuda Bauer's mantra in his activities to promote Holocaust studies and Holocaust awareness around the world from the 1970s through the end of the 1990s. Having come from Israeli academia, which was still quite provincial, if I may say so, in the 1960s, at the beginning of the 1970s, Bauer began globetrotting as early as the 1970s, lecturing at universities, colleges, and public forums, establishing contacts with foreign scholars and educators, first in the United States and later in Europe, and initiating conferences and publications and exchange views with colleagues. From the close relationship he established, for instance, with Professor Franklin Littell in the 1970s to his founding of the periodical Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in 1986. By the way, this periodical became later the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's scholarly periodical and is so until today. From his initiative carried out through their relationship with Robert and Elizabeth Maxwell to convene an international multidisciplinary mega conference, Remembering from the Future, in 1988, and two follow-up conferences with the same title in 1994 and 2000, to his advice to Swedish Prime Minister Göran Persson in 1998 to convene the Stockholm International Forum on the Holocaust conference in January 2000, which led to the creation of the International Task Force for Holocaust Commemoration, Education and Research, which was later renamed IRA, or acronym, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. All these are just a few highlights of a major and successful effort on his part to pull Holocaust studies out from an Israeli and Jewish ghetto and internationalize it. He has often declared, or had often declared to his students and others, that in his eyes, the Holocaust was, and I quote, the central defining event of modern history and of the history of the Jews in particular, end of quote. The organizational internationalization of Holocaust studies drove Bauer to explore the broader implications of the Holocaust itself. Thus, at a certain stage, he started to prefer the term unprecedentedness over uniqueness, pointing to the fact that one should learn from the Holocaust in the field of world politics, as well as in the field of scholarly analyses of other cases of genocide, and develop global activities as a lesson from the Holocaust too. He consequently became interested in studying the murder of the Roma and Sinti during the Nazi regime, the Armenian genocide in 1915, the genocide in Rwanda, the murderous developments in Darfur and Sudan, and other events that can be defined as genocides. Alongside his scholarly interest, he participated in establishing various bodies dealing with the study of genocide and with genocide prevention. Worldwide, his activities and lectures relating to genocide are, I would say, his better known side, and they represent the universal side of his coin. But now, today, I would like to shed light on another aspect of Bauer's historiography. Reading through his entire oeuvre, all his books and articles and so on, one will discover that many of his, what I would call research studies, that is, those for which he did primary archival research and which are focused on more concrete historical topics rather than general overviews and have an extensive scholarly apparatus, these studies deal with Jewish history only, and more precisely, with some very clear topics within it. Indeed, they surround the Holocaust as an event, such as his trilogy on the JDC, yet they in fact tackle a much deeper issue which I would like to call, in Bauer's spirit, the unique or the singular. However, it refers not to the uniqueness of the Holocaust, but to the uniqueness of the Jewish people as a historical phenomenon, explored through the prism of the greatest of all crises, the Shoah. One might describe it as the Jewish Sonderweg, to use a German term, that is the Jewish special path in history. From his perspective, he undoubtedly belonged to the so-called Jerusalem school in Jewish historiography, and about which there are several studies by Ephraim Shmueli, David Myers, and more. And here is a short description of it. I won't read it now, but if you're interested. It is quite amazing to observe that throughout Bauer's academic career, he has returned time and again to aspects of this phenomenon. Moreover, because of his underlying theme, of this underlying theme, he did not really apply methodologies of genocide research in these studies. You won't find the vocabulary or methodology of genocide studies. The apparatuses of these studies demonstrate this characteristic well. In this case, I refer mainly to the following words. First, his studies on the Bricha movement, which sprouted from within some groups of surviving remnants of the Shoah, who directed a mass movement of Jews to Palestine. Yeah. So this is, I relate here to his book, Flight and Rescue, Bricha, that's the Hebrew word for escape, the organized escape of the Jewish survivors of Eastern Europe, 1944 through 1948, which was published in 1970, so before the trilogy on the JDC, as well as to his articles on the causal connection between the Holocaust and the establishment of Israel. Secondly, his already mentioned trilogy on the history of the JDC, which told the story of the enormous efforts of a non-Zionist American Jewish organization from the 1920s or even a little bit earlier through the end of the 1940s to extend aid to Jews in need before and especially during and after the Holocaust, with an emphasis on Holocaust survivors. Recently, Professor Tuvia Frilling of Ben Gurion University completed an extremely important study on the JDC representative in Lisbon, Portugal, Joe Schwartz, and his activities during and after the Holocaust, a study which encompasses more than 2,000 pages in Hebrew, which would be close to 3,000 in English. I hope that a concise 40 pages overview of the study will be published by us at Yad Vashem next year in a series that I edit, Search and Research. So in order to learn much more about the JDC, this will give an overview. Will not it cannot be compared to this enormous study as such, but it is really a very impressive study and is a follow-up to Bauer's research. Thirdly, Bauer's ongoing polemic regarding the American Jewish community's commitment to an investment in rescue activities of European Jewry and its ability or inability to influence US administration policies. The last comprehensive chapter in this dispute that he wrote is could the US government have rescued European Jewry from 2017? That is when he turned 90. He gave this as first as a lecture at the Israeli Academy of Sciences. He also related to this issue in short in a chapter which was called in Hebrew Al Agadot V'Historia, on legends and history, in his book Ha'am HaMechutzaf, which you can see here, the title. המלכותה בכפר הגלובלי, The Contrary People in a Global Perspective, which was published in 2019. His main adversaries in this debate over the years were and still are David Wyman, the late David Wyman, Raphael Medoff, and Alexander Groth. A new book, by the way, on this issue was just published by Richard Brightman. The title is Calculated Restraint, What Allied Leaders Said About the Holocaust. It was published this year in 2025. I haven't read it yet, so I'll have to see what Brightman says about Bauer's thesis. Fourthly, Bauer's various articles on the behavior of Jewish leadership under Nazi rule. One is Yehuda Bauer, תגובותיה של המנהיגות היהודית למדיניות הנאצים, the responses of the Jewish leadership to Nazi policies in Hebrew. It was published in Yalkut Moreshet in 1975. Another article is the Judenräte, Some Conclusions, in a book edited by Israel Gutman and Cynthia Haft, Patterns of Jewish Leadership in Nazi Europe, 1933 through 1945, which was published in 1979 and based on the Yad Vashem conference. Fifthly, his studies on the negotiations between Jewish groups and individuals and the Nazis on rescue during the 1933 to 1944 period, culminating in his book Jews for Sale, Nazi-Jewish Negotiations, 1933 through 1945, which was published in 1994, with later updated versions in German and Hebrew. And last, a series of articles on the phenomenon of Jewish communal organization and its modes of functioning, even during the last days of the Eastern European Shtetlach, which culminated in a book, The Death of the Shtetl, which was published 2009 and depends on what edition, and later also translated into Hebrew. To these topics, which are interrelated and often intertwine and overlap, I would add a seventh topic, a topic which has a different character and yet is related to the issue of the cohesion of the Jewish collectivity, religious Jewry, and the possibility of faith in God after the Holocaust. So let's go a little bit back to Bauer's background. He was born in 1926 and spent his first 13 years in Prague in a Zionist family. His foundations lay therefore both in the multicultural modern Jewish sphere of that city, which was the cradle of a series of great Jewish minds, and in secular Zionist ideology. He made Aliyah in 1939 and spent his formative years in the Yishuv in wartime Palestine, which established itself at this period as the spearhead of the Zionist movement and followed from a distance the almost total erasure of European Jewry and its culture. After having enjoyed a British scholarship for undergraduate studies at the University of Cardiff in Wales, and by the way, he boasted about his knowledge of Welsh and singing in Welsh, he completed his graduate studies at the Hebrew University, which was until 1955 the only university in Israel. In the then political sphere, in those years, everybody in Israel firmly adhered to one ideological stream or another. Bauer became active as a group leader and afterwards as head of the Jerusalem Modi'in tribe in the Scout movement, which had a socialist flair. Afterward, joining the urban Hashomer HaTzair in 1945. Following the establishment of the State of Israel, he joined Kibbutz Shoval of the Hashomer HaTzair movement in the northern Negev, not far from Gaza. It's here to show you it on the map. After having co-founded another kibbutz, Kibbutz Chatzerim, close to Beersheba, which had been established by members of the Scouts and the moderate socialist Hanor HaOved, labor youth. He was also active in MAPAM, the United Workers' Party, the Socialist Zionist party that had emerged from Meretz Zair and was quite strong in the early years of the state of Israel, has now disappeared. It is worth noting that the culture of Hashomer Zair was mainly shaped by people of Polish and Lithuanian Orthodox origin who had undergone extreme secularization during the first decades of the 20th century. Despite its proclaimed secularism, however, this movement had deep traditional Jewish undercurrents. In my interpretation, Bauer is a product, a sophisticated one to be sure, of this background. His public activity in the youth movement, in the kibbutz, in the party, and in the secular humanist Jewish and Israeli movement shows his firm stance in favor of secularism. See, for instance, his article, Secular Humanistic Judaism, Rejecting God. Humans, not God, are the center of this Jewish denomination. Yet, as an involved scholar, he also comprehended the historical stakes of the secularization process for the Jewish people. Therefore, his research strategy has been to first and foremost explore to what extent traditional features of Jewish existence, especially in the diaspora, Jewish solidarity, Jewish communalism, and the readiness to invest in the Jewish future, all paradoxically bound together through ongoing internal ideological feuds, which expresses the Kabbalistic principle of the unity of opposites, Achdut HaHafachim, survived the secularization shift of modern Jewish history. The Holocaust serves undoubtedly as the utmost test case for the examination of these basic characteristics. In examining the extreme situation of the war of annihilation against the Jews, one can test the behavior and the response of Jewish leaders and organizations, both under the Nazi regime and abroad, in Palestine and in other Jewish centers in the free world. And here comes in the issue of the JDC, to the mortal threat to the Jewish collective. And in the immediate post World War II years, one can examine to what extent the will for life and resurrection persisted. As an open minded researcher, Bauer did not always give positive answers to this quest. Jewish organizations and leaders also failed in many cases. Yet, altogether, he, as a scholar interested in the feature of the Jewish collective, viewed the Jewish response both during and after the Holocaust as affirming the basic understanding that the age old tacit characteristics of perseverance continued to drive the Jewish people. In the last decade of his life, Bauer took up this motive again in his book, Ha'am HaMechutzav. It is almost impossible to translate this title into other languages, except for Yiddish, but literally it would be in English, the chutzpahdik people, or in more proper English, the impossible people. The title chosen for the English edition was The Contrary People. It is not reflecting exactly the Hebrew title. This time, however, Bauer became enraged by the post-Zionist attack, and especially by Tel Aviv University historian Shlomo Zand's argument in a book that was translated into many languages and warmly embraced by anti-Zionists and anti-Semites. The title of Zand's book in Hebrew was Matai ve'ech humtza ha'am ha'yehudi, when and how was the Jewish people invented, and was uh, published first in Hebrew in 2008. The title of the English edition, which was published by Verso, the publishing house of the extreme leftist in Britain, was The Invention of the Jewish People. Zand claimed that there is no such thing as the Jewish people, that is, a Jewish national entity, at all, but rather that it is an invention of Zionism with no roots in the history of the Jews and Judaism, which is only a religion. According to him, most Jews actually originate from the Khazari, and the biological descendants of the original Jews or Judeans are probably the Palestinians. Zann's book was severely criticized by many historians of Jewish history, but Bauer was really enraged and wrote his response. This brings us to the issue of religion. Historically, Jewish existence has centered for most generations on the belief, faith in one God and the Jewish people as the chosen people. This raised for Bauer, both as a historian and as a Jew who firmly believed in the need for secularizing the Jewish world, the challenge of coping intellectually with the omission of this so essential ingredient of Jewishness, especially when a considerable part of the Jewish people continues to express its belief in God, even after the Holocaust. This issue, probably the sixth in the aforementioned list, bothered Bauer throughout his adult years. As discussed, such an internal struggle was not alien at all to the political milieu in which he grew up and which he was active for many years. From this point of view, we can understand his extraordinary interest, indeed, his fascination with Rabbi Michael Dov Weissmandel's rescue activities in Slovakia during the Shoah, which he described in his book Jews for Sale, both with admiration for his deeds and with the historical verdict that Weissmandel did not understand the real different essence of the Nazi enmity towards the Jews. From this point of view, we can also understand his fierce polemics in the mid 1970s with Moshe Una, a leading personality in the religious kibbutz movement, the Kibbutz Hadati, an exchange which was published in Yalkut Moreshet, the periodical for Holocaust studies established by Bauer's leftist kibbutz movement, HaKibbutz HaArtzia Shomer Tzir, and edited by him and others. The issue was faith in God vis-a-vis the Shoah. Bauer denies the possibility of any faith in God. He coined the phrase, in the beginning, man created God, and insisted on, and I quote, returning to the sources of humanist morality, which, to be sure, had, according to Bauer, also collapsed in Auschwitz. Though a declared secularist, Bauer, as can be seen, nevertheless felt the need to deal with a religious person on the issue of God's existence. Many atheists could not have cared less about such an issue, but for Bauer it was apparently important to convince the religious fellow Jew that he was wrong. Similarly, he plunged into the writings of the Lubavitcher Rebbe on the Holocaust and reacted to the Rebbe's view in a chapter titled Theology or God the Surgeon in his book Rethinking the Holocaust from 2001. A popular version was, by the way, published several years later in 2007 in Haaretz, God as Surgeon. In my eyes, Bauer thus remained on speaking terms with God, but his stance is mechutzaf, or contrary, or chutzpahdik, the term he uses to describe as a basic characteristic of the Jews. Furthermore, as previously mentioned, time and again he tried in his studies to explore whether the unique characteristics that had bound Jews together through the ages, characteristics that had been shaped to a large extent by the Jewish religion, were still functioning in modern times, even if through other channels. In this context of dialogue with religion, it is not surprising that some of his closest colleagues and allies in the promotion of Holocaust studies in the United States, Franklin Littell, Carol Rittner, and John Pawlikowski, to name a few, were believing but very critical Christians. They were partners with whom he had a common language. Let me tell you a story, is one of Bauer's beloved rhetorical sentences and tricks. Was one, and maybe in his writing is still one. It is, by the way, a highly Jewish traditional approach. The tactics of Midrash were always to present a problem, whether theological, moral, or judicial, through a true or more often an invented story. Therefore, I would like to end my talk with a well known modern Jewish story, too. It tells of a Jewish communist who had emigrated from Eastern Europe. He settled with his family in a village in his new country, a village in which there were Jews because he yearned, and because he yearned for some Yiddishkeit in his surroundings. But he had a young boy, this person, who had to attend school. In the village, there was only one Jewish school and one Catholic one. As an atheist, the communist certainly did not send his boy to the Jewish school because the boy would have to learn daven, pray, participate in Jewish religious ceremonies, eat kosher food, and so on. Thus, he decided to send his son to the Catholic school. When his son returned from his new school at the end of the first day, the communist asked his son, "What did you learn at school today, mein Engel?" The son responded with joy, "We learned about the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." Father sighed for a moment, then got enraged and said, "Listen, son, we have only one God and we don't believe in him." I feel that this story is applicable also to Yehuda Bauer. So thank you for your attention.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. That was really fascinating. Um, you mentioned Tuvia Freeling's study. I just want to mention here that Professor Freeling actually presented on our webinars a couple of years ago, and that video is available, that recording is available on our website, as well as you mentioned the videos of Yehuda Bauer speaking about JDC. So when we send out the thank you email for attending the webinar, we will put links to those in there as well. So thank you for mentioning that. So I'd like to open up the floor to questions now, and this is just a reminder that your microphones are turned off and we're taking questions via the Q&A function. So taking a look here. So this is a comment just to start with. From a former student of Yehuda Bauer's at Hebrew University in 1968 and 69, that she would like to underscore his teaching abilities, where she took a class about the efforts of, he taught about the efforts of the Yeshuv during World War II, and she said they were crystal clear to her. So just sharing that. There's a question about the English summary that you mentioned, that you were talking about earlier. Do you have a sense of when that might be coming out?
Yeah, it is
Sorry,
in
Tuvia
in a
Freeling.
series that I edit. It's called Search and Research. Yad Vashem. Freeling gave it as a lecture, an annual lecture in February this year. He still has to submit the final version. He promised to do it sometime during the summer, and then of course there's the editing process. So I assume that it will be published in 2026.
Okay. Okay, thank you. A question about sort of your experience with Yehuda Bauer. How did, I mean, yes, I think most of your presentation in a way speaks to this, but I'm curious on a more personal level, if you don't mind sharing, how Yehuda Bauer's work and research impacted your perspectives on your research.
Well, as I said, I was never a student of Yehuda Bauer. I came through another path to to Holocaust studies. Originally, I was more interested in linguistics and archaeology and biblical history. And gradually, I moved to modern times, and I ended up with a PhD, which was as a part of, let's say, the Holocaust studies, which was the reason that I was appointed afterwards at Bar Ilan University on this. So I was not a direct student of Yehuda Bauer, but when I started to teach at Bar Ilan University in 1976, and introductory courses on the Holocaust and so on, and I needed to compose bibliographies for the courses. I saw that the only person who had written more comprehensive articles on topics of Jewish councils and ghetto and all kind of things was Bauer. All the other studies at that time available were on, little cases and so on, which you cannot give to a student 100 articles or such thing. But overviews, you had overviews. Now, in when I proceeded in my career, I had arguments with him on some of those overviews, right? Especially we had, I mentioned one exchange regarding genocide studies, but an earlier one was about the um, the um, the question of the causational process from the Holocaust to the establishment of the State of Israel. And he had a very interesting, um, uh, let's say, lecture in 1973, when in Israel the discussion was about who really caused the British to leave Palestine in 1948. Was it the Haganah, the Etzel, the Lehi? And he said none of them. It was the impact of the Holocaust and the survivors, right? And I wrote an article that responded to him and to others in 2000 in Hebrew, was later included in my book in English on Holocaust historiography, a Jewish perspective. And I related to it. And then he reacted by saying, "But I changed my mind since then." Right? And okay, but he had quite an impact with his thesis, and I disagreed. So, and there were other things. There are other things that we agreed upon, but I would say that his impact on me was to provoke. My thoughts and thinking about and looking at the historical evidence and see if I agree or disagree with him. And it was always interesting to talk with him. Right? And we were on several committees together, especially the editorial board of Yad Vashem Studies, where we discuss articles that were submitted and so on. So it was always interesting to hear what he had to say, because he has an enormous knowledge, right? And he knew a lot of languages. He knew Slovakian and Czech and German and Polish and Welsh and English and Hebrew and Yiddish and so on. And he read. Of course, he got a lot of people turned to him and sent him articles and manuscripts and so on. So he read a lot, and he was always updated until the last moment, right? He really, I know from his daughter also that he really, when he died, he went from one room to another, and he wanted to show a book to her, and then he collapsed suddenly. So, but he was
Yeah.
still active and up to date.
There were a couple of questions about Bauer's, I guess we could say, disagreement with Daniel Goldhagen. Um, can you speak to that at all?
Look, Goldhagen is a story by itself, of course, because it was a book that had an enormous resonance when it was published, especially in Germany, but also, and it was harshly criticized by most of the historians in the brown in the field of Holocaust studies, and also Yehuda and also Israel Gutman, who was his buddy. They were very different. They were both in Neshome Atzair, but they were very different in their approaches. They disagreed because look, Goldhagen's book was actually composed of several parts. There was a part about the death marches. What was fine, but he, to his PhD thesis, he added later on when the book was published the first part, and there were a lot of generalizations on the Germans since the beginning of the 19th century, as if they were exterminationists, had an exterminationist approach. If this is so, then you can not understand the high percentage of intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews, for instance. And he didn't deal with the Holocaust in other countries. Close to about 380,000 Jews were murdered by the Romanians, and that is not Germany. So you cannot explain the Holocaust in the way Goldhagen did it, and therefore, from my perspective, as one dealing also with the history of historiography, Goldhagen's book is hardly quoted anymore. It was an enormous eruption in 1996, 97, and so on, but he is not a point of reference anymore. For instance, if you compare to Raoul Hilberg, I also disagree with a lot of things of Raoul Hilberg. And Hilberg was a political scientist and not a historian. And he wrote his book in a very early stage. Was published in 1961. And that is still a book which is a point of reference, right? When you deal with the Shoah, you have to look into Hilberg's book. I'm not sure that you have to read Goldhagen. So okay,
Good
and
point.
Bauer had a similar approach also. It's also a later case which is different, but also was, for instance, Timothy Snyder's book Bloodlands in 2010, which was also had an enormous interest, right? Was translated and so on, but also very problematic. It was with the very generalizing thesis based on putting three maps on one each other, and then you have the bloodlands, as he called it. And is also therefore less quoted today, already now 15 years later. So this happens in historiography. Therefore it's an interesting field.
Right. Um, we have a question from I think they're asking from a survivor's perspective, what books of Bauer's would describe his personal thoughts on the Holocaust? What would you recommend?
Well, in every study also introduces his own views. So, but you have the monographies, and you have books which are collections of his articles, right? And in for instance, rethinking the Holocaust. But you have also earlier books, and there you can there and especially in his most recent books. Where he is very personal. right? And also, let's say, much more political, also with current political trends and so on. But the issue of survivors was dear to him. It was very interesting. He started with the Bericha. Of course, that came also from the Hashomer Hatzair aspect with Abba Kovner, and and later on is the third volume of the JDC trilogy, um, and also in conference, in various conferences. For instance, the Yad Vashem had in 1985 a conference on the surviving remnant, where he also spoke. So, and in his classes, he dealt with it, and many of the stories that he knew that were stories that he had heard from survivors, and therefore that was a major issue for him.
You mentioned the eulogy that was read. Do you
Yeah,
know where people could find that?
yeah, it was afterwards published in Haaretz in Hebrew. It is in
Okay,
Hebrew. I think the Friday after the funeral, or the week after.
okay.
Uh, and I don't have a copy, but it's not. You can find it. It was
It should
published,
be able. Okay.
probably also translated in the English edition of Haaretz. But you should check there at the end in October 2024.
24.
I assume that it's possible to find it. It's not very long. It's very humorous and. Yeah, interesting. And we were laughing during the funeral, right? As if he was there with us. Mm.
Can you elaborate a little bit on Bauer's thoughts on the Shoah versus other acts of genocide? It's a bit of a
Yeah, he
comparison.
thought that was when he when he invented this term of unprecedentedness, right? So and he said that afterwards, indeed, there is no case is exactly as the Holocaust, but still we have to learn from it. And therefore, he was active in organizations for the prevention of genocide and in studies. For instance, there's Barbara Harf, who worked also for the United States for the Secretary of State. Uh, uh, Looking from a sociological perspective at elements that can foresee or that you can think that a genocide can develop, right? So in order to prevent it, he was interested in these things. Um, and he had the contacts with people in Rwanda after the genocide there. So that was in recent decades very central to his activities, but he never wrote a study of any genocide as such. Right?
Okay.
He knew the details. He read books about it, and he would quote them in his speeches and so on. But he did not write a study like the studies that I mentioned on Jewish history.
Okay. Thank you. Um, did Bauer and Fackenheim know each other?
Yeah, they knew each other. I Because Fackenheim made Aliyah, and he also spoke at various instances in Israel. I don't know, maybe that they also had exchanges, but I really don't know about that. Um, um, there were also there were other people like Richard Rubinstein who wrote about faith after Auschwitz. and there were more studies. He read them, but he, his main exchanges were with people of the religious kibbutz, and answer giving an answer to the Rebbe of Chabad of Lubavitch, right? Well, I was really laughing to see how much he invested in responding to these people, right? And let's say real secularists are not interested in these things. Okay.
Very interesting. Okay, I think we're going to wrap up. I want to thank you. This has really been fascinating and really helpful to hear. Um, I hope you've all found this as interesting as I have, and thank you all for joining us. I want to extend our gratitude to Linda and Jerry Spitzer for endowing the Helen Cohn Memorial Lecture and the Miriam Mimi Pasternak Tubin Public Educational Programming from the JDC Archives, which made this webinar possible. Our next webinar, which will take place on July 10th, is Sasha Spirovsky, recipient of the Ruth and David Musher JDC Archives Fellowship for 2024, who will be lecturing on Jewish refugees in the age of the Jewish nation, Soviet Jews as Cold War refugees, or Israeli repatriates, 1972 to 1991. Invitations will be coming out next week, and you can register via our Facebook page or our website. And please sign up for our e-newsletter if you'd like to be added to our mailing list for upcoming public programs. Thanks again, Professor Michman. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. All the best.